Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. So, Bismillah. First things first, this paper, which is the source of this discussion, is it too loud? It feels too loud. Yeah. I get it. That way we can. How about that? Better? Good? Lower, lower, lower. Good. Okay, Bismillah. So the paper that's the source of this discussion is a paper called Living Islam with Purpose by Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah. Dr. Omar we've spoken about before in different occasions, and he's, just to give a very brief introduction to who he is, since he's one of the more important kind of scholarly and intellectual figures when it comes to Islam in America. Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah is a white American convert to Islam, converted to Islam I don't know how many years ago, probably several decades ago. And he's someone who did his PhD in Islamic studies from, I believe it was Michigan. And then after that, he taught for a number of years in Saudi Arabia, and he spent different time in different places around the world. And currently, he's in Naperville, just a suburb outside of Chicago. And he's pretty accessible. He teaches there. He teaches in one of the local theological seminaries. Basically, what we have online, alhamdulillah, which is a good thing. Wow, that was a big difference. Thank you, sister, whoever did that. We have an institution called Nawawi Foundation. Nawawi Foundation, or is it Institute? Can't remember which one it is. But basically, if you go to nawawi.org, you will find this institute, which was essentially founded to support Dr. Omar's work. So the consequence of that is that when you go to the website, you can find a number of papers on different topics. So there's papers, for example, on mercy being a primary characteristic of Islam. There's a paper on the history of Islam in America. There's a paper on innovation and creativity in Islamic thought. A number of different topics that are very important. And one of them, probably, I think the most important paper on that website is this one, Living Islam with Purpose. In the end, it's roughly a 40-page paper. So it's not something that's super small, but it's not, an entire book either. And so what we're going to do is, over the course of however many sessions it takes to cover this, we'll cover it. I've read this paper, alhamdulillah, a number of times, and even still today, when I was rereading through it again, I found some of the things that he was saying in there to be true. When he speaks, for example, about the kind of importance of the work itself, importance of what's being presented in the work itself. So there are some really key concepts that are talked about here. If the sister wants to come in, so you guys are gonna have to come forward a little bit, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. So we're just gonna go through it. Some people may be more or less familiar with kind of a traditional model of Islamic studies that we've wavered here and even here and there for. Some things are good enough that they actually just need to be read. So I would encourage that you just put Omar Abdullah Living Islam with Purpose and read it, and hopefully after the discussions that we're having, ability to process what's there in the writing will be easier, inshallah. So he begins by mentioning this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he says, "You will find that people are mines of gold and silver. The best of you in Islam, the best of you in the time of ignorance before Islam will be the best of you in Islam if they gain understanding of the religion." So he says basically, "Nasu ma'adin," that people are like mines of gold and silver. They're like minerals. And khayrukum fil jahiliyyah, khayrukum fil Islam. That the best of them in jahiliyyah, in the period before Islam, will be the best of them in Islam. إِذَا فَقُهُ, if they gain a deep understanding of the faith. So one of the things to keep in mind here is that first of all, the quality of a person, some people can have really good qualities. They may not have actually accepted Islam. Or they may not be so practicing or observant in their Islam, but they have good qualities. And those good qualities, when Islam is added to them, when they come under the fold of Islam, then they become really, truly materialized. So, for example, this hadith is talking about those who before Islam they have these qualities, and afterwards they will be from amongst the best. But I've also seen cases, for example, of people who were not so observant in their Islam. You know, they weren't actually religious, so quote unquote, but they had really good family upbringings. So the family that the brother came from, for example, the one that's in mind right now, is a brother. He came from a family, was very well-mannered, very good qualities, just wasn't so religious. So at one point in his life, he kind of changed a little bit, became more religious, and became really, subhanAllah, an amazing person. Really, really amazing person, even more than he was before. So there's this concept of there's qualities inside people that should be nurtured and paid attention to. So the Prophet ﷺ is saying this, and what his point here is actually is that even if a person has good faith, so it says the best of them before Islam is the best of them after Islam, إِذَا فَقُهُ, if they have a deep understanding of the faith, right? So it's not enough that they actually believe in and of itself, but they have to go and combine that belief with a solid understanding. That belief has to be connected then also to a solid understanding. Sorry, Siraj, can we get you to move over a little bit? You can just, for the sisters. Yeah, if you can move this way, inshallah. Thank you, sorry. For any of the sisters that are behind, yeah. Jazakallah khair, appreciate it. Is that okay? It's okay, I think. It's good to see you, by the way. Alhamdulillah. It's nice to be here, alhamdulillah. So the point here that he's making is that understanding is very important. Understanding is very important. Someone could be very sincere. Someone could be very passionate. They could be very, adamant about their faith, very much wanting to attain the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if their understanding is off, then there's going to be a problem. And so he says the need for a deeper understanding of Islam in order to achieve excellence clearly applies to Muslims in America. They have exceptional potential. They are intelligent, industrious, and uniquely promising, yet like undiscovered mines of gold and silver, their promise remains largely untapped due to insufficient acquaintance with their faith, its resources, and legacy. So then he goes on to say that what's missing is not a desire to improve in this realm. What's missing is an operational framework that can facilitate this deeper understanding. So I don't know, I'm sure people have dealt with this at some level. I personally know that I've dealt with this in some ways, is that Islam is just vast. Islam as a faith, as a tradition, as an experience, as lived by Muslims of all different backgrounds and understandings and perspectives is vast. And so what can happen is you just find yourself drowning in the body of ideas, drowning in the different things that people say. And so some level of operational framework is needed in order to make sense out of everything that can be put in front of us. So what he does in this paper is he focuses on what he calls 5 operational principles. So these 5 operational principles then are the foundation of the entire work. The first one is trusting reason. The second one is respecting dissent. The third is stressing societal obligations. The fourth is setting priorities. And the fifth is embracing maxims. So we'll talk about these each individually, but again, just to repeat them, that way they can settle in the mind a little bit more. Trusting reason, respecting dissent, stressing societal obligations, setting priorities, and embracing maxims. So these 5 principles are actually age-old Islamic guidelines. As one of the early scholars, Ibn Rahawayh, who was a renowned scholar of hadith and a companion, a contemporary of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he described these legal maxims in general as positions arrived at by reasoning on the basis of the general statements of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So some people will look at these 5 things, they say, well, this person, who is he to put these 5 things? We have hadith, we have Quran, we have all the stuff that's said before. We don't need this random white guy from America to come and give us 5 principles for the understanding of Islam. This is, I think, what would go through some people's minds. And what he's trying to say is that this concept of deriving principles based on the general teachings of Islam is an old concept. And Ibn Rahawayh talks about this from very early on, and scholars have done this throughout history. That you have you have all of these principles and guidelines and statements and reflections of the Prophet ﷺ and the Quran, and what we're going to do then is draw this principle out of it. So he says these 5 principles then are the operational principles to help us to really understand the body of wisdom and guidance that exists in the example of the Prophet ﷺ. They will help us to have moderation, they will help us to have balance in our understanding, and will kind of help us to bridge between the ideas and values of other cultures and religions as well. Because now we have these framework principles here. It's necessary to state, of course, he mentions it's necessary to state that these 5 principles are not all that you need to know about Islam. Right? There are other things to know about Islam as well. They don't substitute a study of theology or law or spirituality, but they are general rules for helping to grasp a broader tradition. So as one of the early scholars, he said, operational knowledge is the wisdom that guides a wise person to benefit from his knowledge. This is a very interesting statement if you think about it, right? So he's saying operational knowledge is the wisdom that guides a wise person to benefit from his knowledge. Okay, so one of the things that was said by, I want to say a Shabi, but I'm not sure, one of these early scholars, they said that the intelligent and wise teacher will lay foundations first. That way that when you get into bigger discussions, you have these foundations that you're on. A lot of times what happens in our discourses nowadays is that people have they have a tendency to like throw out the most like controversial ideas first. So like, this is a big controversial thing, we're going to throw this out and let's all talk about this because we need to talk about this in our communities, otherwise we're going to be doomed forever. And they throw out this idea, or you throw out another idea, or you throw out, but there's actually no foundation that people are basing any of the discussion on. And it sometimes comes from a place, it comes sometimes from a disease in the heart actually. Like one time I remember we were talking about someone or other, and the scholar, he said, he likes, what did he say? يحب أن يتبع شواذ الأقوال. It's an interesting statement. He said this person, he likes to follow, he has a tendency to follow outlier opinions. So, in the body of Islamic thought, you have this huge body, right? And you have things that can fall in different places along this whole trajectory. And then you have stuff that falls like right on the edge, or right outside the edge. So what he was saying is this particular individual, they like to follow all the stuff that's right outside the edge. They don't want to, the stuff that's in the middle, the core that everyone agrees upon, that's the foundation to build upon, they don't want to talk about those things. They want to talk about those other things. So what this statement of the scholar is saying is this operational knowledge is the wisdom that guides a wise person to benefit from their knowledge. So you could have an entire body of information, and I would venture to say that this holds largely true for a number of Muslims in the modern world, especially people maybe, for example, who grow up going to Islamic schools, or they grow up with some sort of exposure to the Muslim community, masjid community, lectures, all these type of things. A lot of times there's large access to information. But where is the ability to make sense out of that information, to benefit from that knowledge? So he says that these principles are needed in that regard. So Islam actually gives us a number of sets of 5, which is an interesting thing. We're talking about 5 operational principles here. Islam gives us a number of sets of 5. One of them, obviously, is the 5 pillars. Another one is the 5 daily prayers. Another one is the 5 act classifications. So when we say something is wajib, or mustahab, or mubah, or makruh, or haram, this is a 5 category classification. There's 5 things in this category. There's something can be obligatory, it can be recommended, it can be permissible, it can be disliked, it can be prohibited. But there's 5 options. In other places, for example, we have 5 core legal maxims, which are going to be mentioned in a second, and I'll comment on that as well. And we also have 5 objectives of Islamic law, 5 major objectives of Islamic law, which I mentioned in the khutbah today. Anyone remember what the 5 are? We've covered them in a number of different occasions. You weren't here, so you're you have, yeah, you can do it in Arabic. Not this one. That was in the khutbah too, but that's not the principle. The sister has it, yeah. Hifd al-aql, you said. Hifd al-nasl. Yeah, so you have 5. 5 major objectives of Islamic law. The preservation of religion, of self, human life, reason, the mind, children or family, and wealth. So these 5 things, 5 objectives Islamic law is always dealing with. We're going to come back to them later in another part, so I won't go over them now again. But religion, self, reason, children, and wealth. It says the core maxims also, since we're going to come back to these as well, that the core maxims of Islamic law are 5. So basically the issue here is that there's this subset of Islamic law called the Qawa'id Fiqhiyya, legal maxims. And what's interesting about these is that some of the things that we consider to be, kind of like signposts of Western law, that show the advancement of Western law or whatever it might be, these things are actually also legal maxims in Islamic law, and sometimes they're actually even hadith, or they're drawn indirectly from hadith at some level. So for example, that the burden of proof is upon the claimant. The one that makes an accusation, the burden of proof is upon them. This is a legal maxim in Islamic law. Innocent until proven guilty is a legal maxim in Islamic law. Al-asl bara'atu dhimma. You have a number of others as well. These are usually, each madhab actually has their own principles and legal maxims in this field, especially when you get into the bigger numbers. The most famous are the 99 that are mentioned at the end of Majallatul Ahkam al-Adaliyah, which was a legal compendium code put together towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. So as part of that, they put 99 legal maxims. And you can find this, actually one of the people who wrote a commentary on this was Shaykh Ahmed al-Zarqa. Not Omar's grandfather, Omar's great-grandfather. So it goes for anyone who knows Omar Zarqa. So these 5 core maxims are, but there's 5 of them. These 5 are agreed upon by everyone. There's no debate in Islamic law that these are 5 major maxims and principles of Muslim legal thought. So the first one is matters will be judged by their purposes. Al-umur bi-maqasidiha. Matters will be judged by their purposes. The second one is certainty will not be overturned by doubt. Al-yaqeen la yazunu bi-shak. Certainty will not be overturned by doubt. So the very common application that everyone knows on this one is that if you know that you made wudu, but you're not sure if you broke your wudu, you have your wudu. Because you're sure that you made it, and you're not sure that you broke it. And the certainty will not be removed by doubt. On the other hand, if you're sure that you broke it, but you're not sure if you remade it, then you don't have it, right? So certainty will not be removed by doubt, and there's others as well, applications of that as well. Number 3 is harm must be removed. Ad-darar yuzal. Harm is to be removed. And this applies to so many things in Islamic law. And it's, again, think about these as like overarching principles. Because what can happen is people can tell you this or they can tell you that. They can try to interpret things in different ways. And you can just keep these principles as like spotlights that are going to figure out, how am I going to read this? So someone's going to come to you and tell you, well, no, Islam says this. And you look at it and you're like, wait a second, that's clearly going to cause a lot of harm. And one of the major principles of Islam is that the harm has to be removed. And what you have to remember with these principles also, these are not, so people will look at it and be like, it's not hadith. The thing is that this, and I hope no one considers this blasphemous, and you understand what I'm saying before you conclude. This is in many ways stronger than a hadith. This is in many ways, these principles are in many ways stronger than a hadith. Not because the word of whoever came up with this principle is more powerful than the Prophet ﷺ, but because this principle is derived from an entire body of hadith. It's more than one, and it's derived from the entire body of rulings of Islam, from the Quran, from the Sunnah. All of those are finding their way to one principle. So the one principle is actually representative of much more than one evidence. So these things then become very important. Number 4 is that hardship must be alleviated. Hardship must be alleviated. Al-mashaqqa tajlibu at-taysir. Al-mashaqqa tajlibu at-taysir. So what does this mean? And how do you see this in Islamic law? In Islamic law, you see whenever there's a hardship that's above average, right? When we're responsible in front of Allah, it's taklif. There's going to be some level of difficulty in doing what we have to do. But there's levels of difficulty that are normal, and then there's levels of difficulty that are above normal. They go beyond what that normal situation would be. So for example, the difficulty that comes with praying on time is a difficulty that normally comes just because that's the responsibility of prayer. But the difficulty that comes with praying on time while traveling, now this is above the normal level of difficulty that we would see in rulings in general. And because of that, Allah has given us a facilitation. That when you're traveling, then you can shorten your prayers, you can combine your prayers according to some of the madhahib and so on. So what you have is an extraordinary amount of difficulty, meaning like in the actual literal sense of extraordinary, it's not ordinary, this amount of difficulty. And that comes then with a level of facilitation. So al-mashaqqa tajlibu at-taysir. And number 5 is al-'ada muhakkama, that custom has the weight of law. Custom has the weight of law. So this basically means that in the absence of a clear evidence in the Sharia, that common practice holds a lot of weight. One of the examples that's commonly given here, or that's usually talked about here, is say you live in like Germany at the time when the euro first comes out. So now in the marketplace you have euros and you have whatever francs, I guess. I don't know. Huh? Yeah, that word. Whatever the German currency was. So you have the German currency and you have euros, right? So you go to the market and someone tells you, you ask, how much does this bottle of water cost? And they say it costs 2. So you say, okay, I'll buy it for 2. And you're going to go to give them 2 now. What 2 are you giving them? Are you giving them the euro or are you giving them the German currency? Okay? You're giving them whatever would be, in this case, you would give them whatever is customarily given in that particular place and time. So maybe in this particular city has already made the transition to euros, and that's commonly known, that this is the common currency now. And so then the assumption is that you are paying 2 euros unless it was specifically stated that you're paying the other currency. But then you might go to a different city, it's in like a different part of the country, where everyone is using the national currency and nobody has transitioned to euros yet. And as soon as you say 2 in the marketplace, it's understood that that 2 goes to the currency of the country, not to the euro. Then you would pay the currency of the country. Understood? So al-'ada muhakkama, custom has the weight of law, deals with, doesn't mean that custom overpowers law. It's a very incorrect understanding. Some people try to use this in the wrong way. Custom does not overpower clear evidences from the Quran or the Sunnah. But custom complements clear evidences from the Quran and the Sunnah, and it also helps us to understand the gaps. On a practical level, if there's something that's not specifically stated, then custom now has a role to define maybe some of the details or what that would look like. So these 5 maxims actually make up the primary portion of the paper. They embody the essential spirit of the religion. They're not just some random principles. These are the essential spirit of the religion itself. So when we get to number 5 of the operational principles, number 5 of the operational principles was embracing maxims. So we'll come back to these legal maxims at that time. So operational principle number 1. Operational principle number 1 is trusting reason. Trusting reason. God has endowed human beings with a certain capacity to understand. And He's actually made this as a distinguishing characteristic of human beings in and of themselves. And the order of the universe, and the fact that the universe is ordered, makes it so that our minds are able to access the amazing complexity of that order and to even recognize it as a marvelous sign of God's existence. And it brings our ability to investigate scientifically any number of things, all because of the reason exists in the first place. The protection, preservation, and cultivation of the power to reason is among the major objectives of Islam. That encouraging people to be able to think properly and to think accurately and to think correctly is a major principle in Islam. And so that's why, some people may have noticed over the course of time, I'm not really big on sloganeering. I'm not really big on emotional manipulation in sermons. Sometimes people get upset with me because they say that your sermons are not like emotional enough. They don't actually feel like a sermon. And that's actually the point. I want people to be able to think about what's being said and not just like feel good about it and therefore accept it. And so this concept of respecting reason is very, very important in Islam, and the pivot of moral responsibility, of taklif that we talked about earlier, the pivot of moral responsibility in Islam is dependent on reason in the first place. And that's why, for example, in Islamic law, the mentally incapacitated, the insane, children, they don't have the same weight in front of the law. They're not responsible the way that a full-grown, fully understanding man or woman is held responsible, because their mind is not at the same level. So actually our entire moral responsibility with Allah is largely related to this concept of reason. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in many different places in the Quran talks about, why don't they reason, why don't they think, why do they not reflect, why don't they consider. All of these different things in the Quran are encouraging us to be engaged in that endeavor. Imam al-Ghazali, who was one of the most acclaimed scholars in Islamic history, he said the following about this issue of reason. He said, "Know that the question of reason's preeminence is something that does not require much trouble to clarify, especially since the eminence of knowledge itself only becomes clear by virtue of reason." So how can you can't even appreciate knowledge itself without an appreciation for reason. And reason is the source of knowledge, the place where it manifests itself, and the foundation upon which it stands. Knowledge flows from reason like fruit from a tree, like light from the sun, like sight from the eye. And how could something like this not have preeminence when it also is the means to felicity in this world and the next? How can there be any doubt about it? How can we even doubt the importance of reason? We're not able to do any of this. We're not able to understand why we pray. We're not able to understand the benefits of it. We're not able to understand our relationship with Allah, and all of this is based upon reason. And so it's very primary in that regard. Many Western academics, they've wrongly looked upon Islamic thought the history of Islamic thought, and they refer to the Mu'tazili school of theology as the sole example of Islamic rationalism. This is something that you'll see very commonly among Western authors. They'll talk about the different theological schools or trends in Muslim history, and they'll say that this Mu'tazila group, this was the group that represented Islamic rationalism. And that's wrong. There's no other way to really say this. It's just straight out wrong. In reality, its rivals, and I go back and forth from quoting, so don't assume all of this is from me. In reality, its rivals, the Ash'ari and the Maturidi schools, which make up the majority of mainstream Sunni thought, are no less rationalistic than this Mu'tazila school, and their speculations consistently demonstrate originality and intellectual depth. So this, and pragmatism and reason and understanding situations and providing rulings, all of this is always there in all of the schools of thought. Even sometimes it's considered that the Hanbali school is more literal. You know, people usually say that the Hanbali school is more literal, and then they'll go and they'll say, and look at Ibn Taymiyyah, this guy was like a strict literalist. It's complete ignorance. This is very, sometimes people say things, it's just very difficult to stomach them. Complete ignorance. Ibn Taymiyyah and his student Ibn Qayyim actually represent the more rationalist strand of the Hanbali scholars. So if you're to talk about it, they're actually a shining example of rationalism in some of the rulings that they've stated. For example, I haven't, just to be fair, I read this in someone else's fatwa. I haven't read this from Ibn Taymiyyah himself in his actual own work, so it's a quote of someone else, so it may not be 100% correct. So but I'm saying it as an example that comes to mind of Ibn Taymiyyah's rationalism. He was referenced by this other scholar as holding the opinion that the two witnesses issue for women in the verse, that 2-to-1 witness concept, if the social cultural conditions changed, he says basically what he's saying is this verse was revealed in relation to financial transactions, and it was revealed in a place where women knew less about financial transactions than men did. And if that was to change, then their witness would be even. So this was attributed to Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah, in another place, for example, he has a different opinion than a lot of the madhahib on safar, on traveling. When you become a traveler, when you're not a traveler, how long that traveling lasts, all of it is based on logic. It's all based on rational reason. So he says, like most of the madhahib, they give distances and they give stuff like this. Ibn Taymiyyah says, there's no clear evidence for any of those. Basically, if you are what is customarily considered to be a traveler, then you're a traveler. So 48 miles doesn't matter. Did you pack your bags? Are you staying somewhere that's not home? These become actually the considerations. So it's very rational, right? But people, for some reason, they don't want to consider these things. The conflict between religion and science was virtually unknown in Islamic intellectual history. This was not a problem that existed. One of the places where you see this is in the work of Jabir ibn Hayyan, who was a chemist, and he actually refuted alchemy. You know, alchemy in the Middle Ages, like this concept of you can take something and you'll come up with a science that will turn it into gold. It's a really good name for like a musician. There's a producer who's called The Alchemist. It's a brilliant name for a producer, but it doesn't really make sense in science, right? So he rejected this concept, and he was really big on the real chemistry. And he wrote a book called the Book of 70, and it's a very famous old work in chemistry. And he starts off the book by saying, certainly the mention of God is more noble, majestic, and great than what follows. So imagine, right? This is someone who's a master chemist, who's taken the time to write this book, which became a major work in chemistry. And he starts off his book by saying, dhikrullah is better than what's in my book. This shows like where is the mind of the scientist? The scientist does not see any sort of contradiction between science and faith. So the remembrance of Allah is better than everything that's coming after in my book. And then he opens the book, look at this is fascinating. He opens the book with a lengthy discussion on the imperative of purifying the soul from ostentation, from showing off and arrogance, and other spiritual defects as a prerequisite to the pursuit of scientific learning. Amazing, right? He puts in the beginning, you're going to engage in scientific learning, that means you have to be objective. You can't be objective unless you purify your soul. The book is called the Book of 70, Kitab al-Sabi'in. Jabir ibn Hayyan. Yeah, you're welcome. So this is something that you see all over the place with Muslim scholars. You see this also with Ibn Rushd, who's known in the West as Averroes. I think I say that wrong, but Ibn Rushd. And he was an Andalusian judge and legal scholar, left an influence on Islamic law that's known today. Actually, Ibn Rushd, he wrote his Bidayat al-Mujtahid is a very unique book that he wrote in Islamic law, or to be more technical, that he dictated in Islamic law and his students wrote. You don't usually see this. What he does is he says like, okay, now we're going to talk about purification. Purification has 8 chapters. The first chapter is this. In the first chapter, there's 6 subsets. Subset number 1 is this issue. This issue has 3 opinions. These people held this one, these people held this one, these people held this one. The reason why they differ, he gives this in almost every... The reason for their difference is how they understand this particular hadith. So not only is he giving you the opinions, he's giving you the entire legal methodology and thought of the scholars themselves. It's incredible work. No other fiqh book I shouldn't say no other fiqh book, because there's like tons of books that haven't even been printed. But this is probably the most prominent book that does this, that we know of. I haven't seen of anything else really that takes this approach. So he wrote this book. At the same time, his commentaries on Aristotle affected the course of European intellectual history. So at the same time that he was a brilliant legal scholar, he was a brilliant philosopher. He also wrote over 50 works in law, philosophy, medicine, psychology, zoology, astronomy. It's said that his legal opinions were eagerly awaited in Muslim Spain as his interpretations of the law. So his medical opinion and his legal opinion, whatever it is, everyone's like, he has an opinion on some issue in medicine, we have to hear it. He has an opinion on something in law, we have to hear it. Right? This is just incredible that this is the way that people were. Another example of this is Fakhruddin al-Razi. Fakhruddin al-Razi wrote one of the most famous commentaries on the Quran, tafsir. It's a very, very large commentary. It's called the Tafsir al-Kabir. It's called the big commentary. The technical name of it is what it is. It's just a massive work. And at the same time, he was a theologian, he was a legal theorist, he had mastered the rational empirical sciences of his age, and he wrote a book called Muhassal Afkar al-Mutaqaddimin wal-Mutaakhirin, the consummation of ancient and modern ideas. The consummation of ancient and modern ideas, in which he summarized the philosophical, theological, and scientific thought of prominent ancient and latter-day thinkers. So they didn't see this issue of any sort of problem between scientific inquiry and Islamic thought. Another thing that we see is in Islamic legal thought in particular, Asrar is on Ismail duty because my wife is speaking at ISOC, so everyone make dua for Asrar, inshallah. The Islamic legal thought divides rulings into 2 categories in relation to reason. So rulings in Islamic law in relation to reason, there's 2 categories. One of those categories is what is called tawqifi, which means it's immutably fixed. There's no real discussion on it. You don't have to, these rulings are not, they're accessible to intellectual contemplation, but they are not contingent on discernible rationales and conditional purposes, and therefore cannot be changed. It's hard to translate, or it's hard to explain a statement that is so brilliant in and of itself. So it says, I'll say it again, its rulings are accessible to intellectual contemplation, but they are not contingent on discernible rationales and conditional purposes, and therefore cannot be changed. So what that means is you have a ruling, we can reflect on the ruling, what might have been like, we can contemplate on it. But can we understand its rationale, its purpose, like condition, that's why it, in order to extend it into other circumstances and stuff like that? No. We can't, for example, we pray 5 times a day. We pray 5 times a day because Allah and His Messenger told us to pray 5 times a day. Can we contemplate about like the wisdoms behind it? Yes, it's really actually beneficial for us to have these time spaces where we can pray. It doesn't have to be exactly in those 10 minutes. It's beneficial to have a prayer in the morning, prayer in the evening, in the middle of the day, in the afternoon. All of these stuff, we can contemplate over it and make sense out of it rationally. But can we say like, well, the reason we have these 5 prayers at these 5 times is in order to remind us across the day. So basically, if we get electricity, then people can be up earlier. If they get up earlier, then their prayer should be earlier in the day. If they get up later, then their prayer should be later in the day, and then their Isha will change accordingly because it's like it has to be these many hours apart and whatever. It doesn't go like that, right? These are fixed. There's certain rulings that are fixed. These are actually not the majority. The second category is rationale based. So the rulings have rationales, they have purposes, and they can be accessible to understanding and reason and ongoing legal interpretation. So it's the understanding of why we do the particular thing. It makes sense, and we know why it's there, and so we can consider whether or not it applies in whatever context we might be in. So we see these 2 categories here. This large portion of the law, which is the rationale-based laws, this is what gives Islamic law flexibility and relevance in changing times and places. So one of the misnomers, or one of the misconceptions that a lot of non-Muslims have, and perhaps Muslims, about Islam. Sorry, I went on like a 10-year Back to the Future hit right there. I'll tell you where I went. So one of the things that people think about Islam is because Islam is based on text, it doesn't change. It doesn't change. Islamic law doesn't change. It's not entirely true. There's things that are immutable, there's principles, and we're going to come to it more and more. They do not change, absolutely. But the branches can change. There can be shifts based on time and place. The details can be altered a little bit here and there. The thing that I was thinking about was when I was early in my Islam and we had this class at UCSD, and the concept of ijtihad. Subhanallah, man, we were so ignorant. Ijtihad came up in class. And this professor, who was a professor of history, he wasn't a professor of Islamic law or anything, but he was a professor of history, and he was basically saying that, like, no, there can be ijtihad. And we were sitting there in class arguing, like, what are you talking about? There cannot be ijtihad. The gates of ijtihad were closed. This was the position that we were arguing, which is a complete nonsense position. It's completely false in the actual body of Islamic thought. It's completely false. But we, as like zealous young Muslims, we thought that we had the right opinion. I'm just looking back on it like, oh my God, we were so foolish. We really didn't know what we were talking about. So it's not only non-Muslims that have these misunderstandings at times. So these rationale-based rulings, they make up the core of Islamic law. The general perspective is that if something is an act of worship, we don't have to be able to understand its rationale. We just do it. But if it's something that relates to everyday life, then the ruling on something that relates to everyday life is rational. And we should be able to understand then what the ruling is. So like if we're not supposed to take interest from loans, we can understand why there's consequences for stuff like that. If we're not supposed to steal people's stuff, you can understand that there's consequences to that. If you're not supposed to assault other people, whatever it is. All of these things have rational reasoning behind them. Sometimes you see a mix. So for example, if you have ritual prayer, okay? The ritual prayer, some of them can be out loud, and some of them are not out loud, right? So we pray Fajr, Maghrib, Isha out loud. We pray Dhuhr and Asr, it's not audible. There's a wisdom, we can, that's the way that it is. But we know that when the prayer is audible, we understand that the reason, like one of the wisdoms behind that is so that the people who are praying behind the imam can hear the recitation of the Quran, right? I mean, that's That's a reasonable conclusion. So if someone comes then and says, well, we need to adopt microphones so that in a larger congregation, and speakers, so that in a larger congregation, people who are farther away can hear the one who's leading the prayer. Then someone could come and say, no, this is an act of worship. We do not introduce new things into acts of worship. Okay? So no, this is not, we're not introducing something new into the act of worship. The act of worship is staying the same. All that's happening is you're magnifying the voice, which is the objective in the first place. So it's not, so sometimes you can see that there's overlaps here and there. In the modern world, we use microphones. In the pre-modern world, Muslim architects came up with ways to build buildings and stuff like that so that the acoustics would carry into different kind of spaces. So this rationality within the body of Islamic thought always leads to a field of study, and it leads to Islamic law being a field of study that requires some level of development in that regard. You have to be able to reason in order to engage information in this realm. So, for example, each text has a context, and the religious scholar must know both. And legal scholars, therefore, were referred to as fuqaha, whereas textual scholars were referred to as hufadh. Right? So if you're a hafiz, it's a beautiful thing. It's great. You memorized maybe the Quran, or maybe you memorized Bukhari, maybe you memorized Muslim, maybe you memorized Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawood, Nasa'i. Maybe you memorized hundreds and thousands of hadith. But in the end of the day, if that's all that the person has done, they're a hafiz. They're not a faqih. And the faqih is different than the hafiz. Why does this word matter that we're even saying this? Why? Because for non-Arabic speakers, remember in the very beginning, the hadith that was mentioned, that the best of you before Islam are the best of you after Islam, if you get fiqh. If the person gets fiqh, which means they get a deep understanding. So that the scholars of law are not people who just memorize. The scholars of law are people of understanding. They're literally called people of understanding. So this is something that has been seen across Islamic thought and across different eras of Islam and the way that it flourished in different places. There's also a study by an academic, his name is Larry Poston, called Islamic Dawah in the West. And what he did in this study actually is he looked at what are the most common factors for people accepting Islam. What are the most common factors for people who convert to Islam? And one of the things that he found was Islam's compatibility with reason and its consistence with common sense as one of its major attractions. This is something that people liked about Islam. Just as you know, some of the other ones, the top reasons were, number one, simplicity of doctrine. Number two, rationality. Number three, absolute monotheism. Number four, this worldly focus. That although we're obviously seeking the hereafter, Islam is very practical in the sense of our everyday lives. And number five is a lack of priesthood. These were the five top reasons that were mentioned for people who are coming into Islam. So this operational principle number one then is the principle of respecting reason. Respecting reason and how that has such an important role in the development of Islamic thought. Our time is basically up, so I don't think it's good to start the next one. But operational principle number two is respecting dissent. Very, very, very important one as well, which we'll get into detail next time that I come. It's basically the concept of adab al-ikhtilaf. Difference of opinion, respecting that difference of opinion. Where does it stop? Where does it end? What does it look like? How has it been practiced? All of that stuff is principle number two. So number one, just to remember and keep with us, is to respect reason. And we'll stop here if there's any questions that people have on anything that I said or anything that's unclear. Anyone else? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Okay. What is the English word for ijtihad? There is not an English word for ijtihad. But I'll give you the definition. The definition, ijtihad, comes from, and actually just recently I realized that people I'll come back to it. So the technical definition, ijtihad, comes from a root of juhd, which means to exert effort. Like sometimes, for example, Ismail, he likes to try to lift things. Now he's running in the hallway. He likes to try to lift things. So sometimes he'll go to like the ottoman, right, in front of the couch. It's a very large piece of furniture for a small child. And he'll get in his thing or he's lifting things. He'll just go to the ottoman and he grab it. So he puts juhd into it. He puts some effort into trying to lift that ottoman. Okay? The word ijtihad comes from that effort. So ijtihad is basically for someone who is qualified to do so, for them to exert the highest amount of effort in trying to come to an understanding as to what Allah and His Messenger want on any particular question. That's really what ijtihad is. Ijtihad in a technical Islamic study sense is the process of saying what Allah and His Messenger want on something. So if someone says, people are writing in the Mus'haf. This came up today, right? Someone says people are writing in the Mus'haf. And what's the ruling on that? So for someone to say it's permissible for them to write in the Mus'haf, for example, that's an ijtihad. There's a level of reasoning and derivation that has to happen. It might not be like my personal fatwa. I'm not the one who did the ijtihad, but it's someone else's ijtihad at some point. But then to say like, okay, it's permissible for them to write in the Mus'haf, but since the Mus'haf is a waqf for the masjid and not their own personal Mus'haf, it's not permissible for them to write in it because it's not theirs. That's also an ijtihad, right? But for someone to say like, there's issues that we need to think about as a Muslim community and we need to kind of like push back and have ideas and embrace the modern world and all of these kind of things, it's not really ijtihad. Ijtihad is a very technical process of it's basically deriving a ruling according to the teachings of Islam. Yes, Hadir. The legal maxims, yeah. The legal maxims. The first of the legal maxims is that actions are known by their purposes, or I don't remember exactly the term. Al-umur bi maqasidiha. Yeah. So it's going to come later, just to be fair, but who knows how much later that's going to be with how long it's taking to get through this material. So al-umur bi maqasidiha, actions are by their purposes or their intentions, is basically the same as al-a'malu bin niyat. That you have to look at the intent behind something. So, I don't know if I want to bring up this controversy, but sometimes someone could say that they're doing something for a particular reason, but when you look at it, there's actually some different intent behind it. So I'll give you actually here's a good example. Very practical example for young people. You can have an action that looks exactly the same, and its ruling is different. Okay? So one person might, for example, let's say for example that they work in youth group for an extended period of time with someone else. That other person happens to be of the opposite gender. So at the end of like this person leaving the youth group, they come up with this idea that let's get a gift for that person. So the brother says, let's get a gift for the sister, just for the sake of argument. If the intent behind that is pure and wholesome, then the action is not a problem. But if the intent behind that is that this brother actually likes the sister and he's trying to squeeze his way into a favorable position with her so that later on he can try to do other things and then eventually call her family or whatever it might be, then that's not permissible. So you have something that's exactly the same, but the intent behind it changes the situation. So the idea is that in general, when we're looking at things, we should consider what were people's intent. Another example of this is that sometimes you forgive people for things that they say because you know that they don't have bad intent behind it. It might just, so for example, for someone like myself, I'm sure it happened, I think, it probably happens a lot more with someone who's in my kind of position, where I was in the front of a community that's very diverse, speaks a lot of different languages and different backgrounds and cultures. and I come from a particular background and culture, and so someone will say something, and you're like, wow. If it wasn't for the fact that I'm considering your intent, and I know that actually what you're trying to say is really nice, that's extremely offensive, you know. But based on the intent, you judge their action based on the intent that you know that they're trying to say, you know. So this is the general concept. There's a really good example for it because it happened recently, but I can't remember what it was. Someone said something, and then I told my wife, I was like, "Did you hear that? Do you realize what they just said?" And we were like, "Yeah, they just meant they didn't mean anything by it. They were trying to be nice." So you just move on with it, you know. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, Ihab. This is Ihab, by the way. Came from New Jersey, mashallah. He was actually the speaker at his wedding. Was our closest friend in Egypt. It was one of our classmates. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. The three reasons for converting: simplicity of doctrine, rationality, absolute monotheism, this worldly focus, and lack of a priesthood. Got it? I don't know if I thought it was pretty cool that there's research like that. Should have assumed that there was. She's got it. Okay. You got it? Okay. And you can remember, you can find this paper. If you just search for Living Islam with Purpose, Omar Abdullah, Abdallah, you'll find it. And then you have it as a reference. You can print it out, carry it around to your dinner parties, meet your friends with it, talk to them about it. It's a very important paper. Very important. So, okay. Sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. Jazakumullah khairan. May Allah accept from all of us and forgive us of our shortcomings. Ameen. And unite between us always in goodness. Ameen. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.